Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, activists, government leaders. We speak with each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome photographer and journalist Susan Hertog to the program. Her latest book is Dangerous Ambition, Rebecca West and Dorothy Thompson, New Women in Search of Love and Power, which has just been published by Ballantine Books. Probably without knowing it, many of us owe a debt of gratitude to these pioneering women. Despite experiencing numerous setbacks in love, and in spite of the Victorian values of their time, which sought to limit the roles women could play outside the home, they forged ahead and created amazing writing careers, using their journalism and fiction writing to tackle the most important issues of their time. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
I suspect for most Americans, the name Dorothy Thompson and Rebecca West don't even ring a bell. So what prompted you to write a biography of these women, one English, one American?
Well, first of all, I've always been interested in the way women construct their lives, how much time and energy they decide to devote to their families, their marriage, their husbands, their domestic responsibilities, and how much time and energy they use to develop their own careers outside the home. And my first foray, literary foray, was to study the life of Anne Morrow Lindbergh. And she was, by necessity, the quintessential submissive wife, basically because her husband was a world-renowned celebrity, and she couldn't speak her mind without destroying his reputation. And this time I wanted to write about women who, so to speak, threw caution to the wind, who felt they had no restraints, despite their Victorian eras, the Victorian era into which they were born. They were both born in the early 1890s. They weren't constrained by social expectations. They were bigger than society's rules, and they couldn't do anything but be who they were.
So how do you think they got to be that way?
It's inexplicable, really. I mean, it's the kind of thing that one can attribute to genius. You know, what is a genius? A genius is someone who comes out of nowhere, from humble roots, and for just on the energy of their will and their courage and their intellect, they grapple with the vital issues of the day and emerge triumphant. There's nothing in their background that could have predicted that Rebecca West or Dorothy Thompson would have become who they were.
Tell us about the time during which they came into young adulthood.
Well, it was the period between the wars, and as you know, after World War I, society was in a great upheaval, not only because of the war itself and men fighting side by side in the trenches, and it kind of broke down all the social demarcations, so to speak, but also because women were able to flood into the marketplace while the men were away in doing jobs that they were never able to do before. And and also in after the war in America in 1919, the women got the vote, and in England in 1917, a little bit earlier. But most women after World War I went back into their kitchens, and despite the fact that they had the vote, they voted like their husbands. Some did not.
Now, both West and Thompson, they started work early, and they probably started work, well, before the war or during the war, right?
They first got their feet wet, so to speak, in social policy as suffragists. And Dorothy Thompson was part of the New York suffragist movement. And in London, in Britain, so was Rebecca West. And they realized that they had the capacity and the personality and the intellect to change things. And as they grew into maturity, especially in the late 20s, early 30s, and they saw that fascist dictators were rising up to sweep through Europe and dominate and threaten Western civilization, they became totally passionate. And although they weren't together, they worked in tandem toward the same goal.
Is that what drew them into journalism? Is that what got them into journalism, this buildup of fascism and their need to, and opportunity to write about it?
Well, they first got into journalism because of women's rights.
Okay.
And then one has to distinguish between them. Dorothy Thompson was what we would call now a public policy wonk. She was interested in what was happening today. She was a huntress. She wanted to get the story, and she wanted to do it right, and she wanted to do it fast, and she knew she had to do that in order to succeed. Rebecca West was not a huntress. She was more like an observer and an intellect. And she was an autodidact. She steeped herself in classical history and literature and moral philosophy. And she saw the big picture. But nonetheless, they were both passionate about, of course, preserving Western civilization and democracy as we know it.
Somehow along the way, Rebecca met H.G. Wells, who was I guess at the time, very famous British.
He was a rock star.
A rock star. Was he the male figure who most affected her life?
Yes and no. Her father was, in the sense that her father was a journalist, and a brilliant journalist, but he had abandoned her family. But it was through him that she came to understand the value of journalism, and she also came to like older men. You know, the loss of a parent, a father, made her very attracted to older men. And when she met H.G. Wells, first of all, she was 19, believe it or not, and he was 46. And he was brilliant and iconic. And he had already written The War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The Island of Dr. Moreau. He was married, had 2 children, but she had the guts, working for this feminist magazine, The Free Woman, to criticize his latest novel, which was called Marriage. And she wrote that H.G. Wells was a misogynist. He knew nothing about women. He knew nothing about marriage. And he saw them as simpering, gold-digging women, that women were simpering and helpless. And she said so in black and white. And he read this magazine and he said, my God, who's this whippersnapper of a young woman who dares to challenge me? But I love it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he invited her to his home, and where he lived with his simpering, gold-digging wife.
Right, right.
And she was immediately smitten with him, and he with her.
And they became lovers, I mean, for a fairly long time, and had a son together.
They did.
Although Wells did not acknowledge the son.
He had made a deal with his wife that he wouldn't divorce her, but he was free to have affairs, and this wasn't the first time he had a child out of wedlock. And he would not acknowledge Anthony Panther West because it would have brought a stain to his respectability.
And Rebecca went along with that?
She went along with it for a while because he had promised to marry her. And within, a couple of years, she realized this was never going to happen. And she had already had a journalistic career. She had already been a literary critic, and she sent this little boy, Anthony, off to school when he was 3 years old and moved to London and started to develop her career.
Now, the rise of fascism in Europe was a big issue for her.
Tremendous.
She covered that. She later covered the Nuremberg trials for the New Yorker. Was that I think 2 articles for the New Yorker on the Nuremberg trials?
Yes.
Was that an early example of literary journalism? Would you call it that?
Absolutely. She was what Lionel Trilling would have called a public intellectual, someone who stood at the bloody crossroads of politics and literature. And she was an observer. The thing about those articles for Nuremberg is that they're more like essays in the potential of human good and evil. And she could find a world of understanding in just observing the people on the docket, those German officials. And what's wild is that she, I think once in the first article, mentioned the Jews as the victims of the Nazis. She wasn't interested in that. She was interested in personalities, motivations, good and evil, and it was a treatise on philosophy. The second one as well, which was at the end of the trial, when the decisions were read on who would live and who would die, who was to be hanged and who was to be set free. And again, she says, neither the victors nor the vanquished were pure of heart. By definition of their humanity, they were guilty and they were evil. And that's very nice as a philosophical treatise, but to me it kind of spoke of moral cowardice.
Right.
We're
going to have to take a break. Then we'll be back with more with Susan Hertog, author of Dangerous Ambition, Rebecca West and Dorothy Thompson, New Women in Search of Love and Power.
That's it.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy at the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Susan Hertog, author of Dangerous Ambition, Rebecca West and Dorothy Thompson, New Women in Search of Love and Power. It's just been published by Ballantine Books. Now, in the 1920s, Dorothy Thompson was living in Europe, also watching the rise of fascism and writing about it. She married a Jewish man who turned out to be a bounder, And later she married Sinclair Lewis, who was the famous American novelist. It's interesting, you know, here again, the marriage of a talented, ambitious woman to a talented, successful, great man led to a tortured relationship, a long one, but a tortured one. Is a lesson in that to stay away from great men? Especially if you want to have a career of your own? Is that the message?
Well, in a way, yes. They were too much alike. They were very ambitious, and each one of them needed a wife. And they too had a son, like Rebecca West and H.G. Wells. And basically, no one was at home, and no one wanted to take care of him. But it was more than that. Sinclair Lewis was an alcoholic. And she knew he was an alcoholic, but she was, as the daughter of a Methodist preacher, she felt she could save him. And of course, that's the kiss of death. You can't save anybody, including those you love. You can try to influence them, but she was not effective in that way. And she realized a couple of days into her honeymoon that he would never change, and he became a very abusive, destructive drunk. And she realized she had to get away from him. And she did. She went back to Europe, where she had been a foreign correspondent, and she saw firsthand the effects of Nazism in the streets of Berlin. And she realized that when she had been there only 4 years before, everything was free. Everybody could talk and speak and exchange ideas. And when she went back, she realized nothing was the same, that they had stripped Jews of their rights. And they had stripped their citizens, all their citizens, of their rights. And Hitler was hell-bent on taking over the world, dominating Europe. And she realized that this was urgent, that America had to confront the idea that this was not just Europe's war. It was Western democracy's war. Mm-hmm. And when she came home, she wrote a book about Hitler, but she also realized that FDR, who was in power during most of the 30s throughout the war, was the president who understood that he understood the stakes, but that he had to convince the people to go along with him. And she did in her columns for the New York Herald Tribune. She had 8 to 10 million readers a day. And in her radio show, she had 5 million listeners a week. And she wrote some of his fireside chats. And she marshaled.
And she had been very much against FDR in the beginning, right?
Yes.
She thought he was trying to be a kind of dictator, but she finally came around to feeling that he was the man for the moment.
Yes, she didn't like his packing of the court.
Right.
And she thought, you know, you let down the dams and the dictators will take over. But she realized that this was somebody who was really very smart, a great politician, and understood what that moment in time required.
Of her work, Thompson's work, what work of hers stands out for you?
Well, she was mainly a short form writer. She was, you know, her columns are really brilliant pieces of journalism and kind of feature articles. And they capture the moment, but they also have a very strong moral core, which is exactly what people needed at that moment in time. And many of our colleagues, even Walter Lippmann, were restrained in their desire to intervene and to be passionate about what she saw as an imminent threat to American democracy.
More moral courage, you thought she had than some of the others?
Say it again?
More moral courage?
I think she did.
Yeah.
She didn't care about her reputation. And as a matter of fact, she lost her job at the New York Herald Tribune in supporting Roosevelt. They were supporting Wilkie. It was a very right-wing newspaper at that time.
And later, after the war, she got into trouble for criticizing the creation of Israel. She wasn't too happy about the whole Zionist thing. And that was that what really finally killed off her career?
It really was. And what's so interesting about that is that during the war, she saw the creation of the state of Israel as a moral imperative, and had helped rescue Jews out of occupied Europe. And yet, when the state of Israel was established, she did a complete 180. She believed that it was nationalism that had created World War II, and that the Jews in Israel were so nationalistic, and that the Jews in America had a dual loyalty, and they were, in a sense, they had adopted the racism that the Nazis had used against them.
Towards the Palestinians.
Toward the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And she came down on the side of the Palestinians. And in America, that wasn't a very good thing to do. And she became a spokesperson for the Palestinians. And they said either, you know, it was the Bell Syndicate at that point that she worked for, and they said either stop being an advocate or
you're out.
Or you're out.
Both women were, I mean, they were enormously successful writers at their time. Dorothy Thompson, you know, had this column that reached so many people. She got honorary degrees. West was extremely successful. Her books and articles, she made the cover of Time magazine. She received honors from the French government, the British government. And yet, nowadays, you know, they are not known the way, say, Walter Lippmann was, or other writers of that time who wrote about, you know, the war and Nazism. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not certain. One could say it was because they were women, but I'm not content with saying that. Dorothy Thompson was a bit self-apologetic. She was a journalist, but she felt journalism was merely the first draft of history. And she understood that as a journalist, her work might be ephemeral. She didn't like the idea of feminism because she felt she, as a woman, had proven that women can do as well as men. As far as Rebecca West was concerned, for whatever reason, people remember Virginia Woolf more than they remember Rebecca West. And they remember Virginia Woolf because Virginia Woolf was a pure and simple feminist. She was brilliant. They were similar in their points of view about women and women's rights and the ability to succeed. But Rebecca West loved men. And in a sense, it was, her work is magnificent. I think she really was a literary genius. But she never felt that she was sleeping with the enemy, so to speak, as other feminists did. And I'm not sure why she's not remembered, because her work is certainly, her prose, her books, I mean, just take Black Lamb, Gray Falcon. I mean, it is still considered the definitive work about the Balkans. Her
and was very prescient of what happened in the 90s there, certainly.
Very prescient.
Right.
And so much of her work is valuable even today.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Hopefully your book will make people pick up the work of Rebecca West and Dorothy Thompson and become acquainted with these very accomplished writers. We hope so.
I hope so too, and thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank Susan Hertog for joining us today. Dangerous Ambition, Rebecca West and Dorothy Thompson, New Women in Search of Love and Power, has just been published by Ballantine Books for the City University of New York and 1-to-1. I'm Sheryl McCarthy.